March 17, 1943, 2:47 a.m., North Atlantic, 320 miles southwest of Iceland. Captain Lieutenant Werner Schultz felt it before he heard it, a tremor through the U-boat's steel hull that made his coffee ripple in concentric circles. In the red-lit control room of U-247, 43 men held their breath. Above them, somewhere in the absolute darkness of a moonless night, something was circling. Schultz pressed his eye against the periscope, seeing nothing but black water meeting blacker sky, no stars, no moon. Cloud cover stretched for 100 miles in every direction. They should have been invisible. The depth charges began falling at 2:48 a.m. The first explosion lifted U-247's stern 3 meters, slamming Schultz against the periscope housing. The second and third followed in mathematical precision, each detonation closer than the last. In the chaos, men shouting, lights flickering, water spraying from a dozen stress fractures. Schultz understood something that would haunt him for the remaining 17 months of his life. The Americans could see him in complete darkness. Through 60 meters of ocean, they could see him as clearly as if he were sailing in daylight under a cloudless sky. This impossibility would shatter the Kriegsmarine's submarine warfare doctrine within 18 months. The technology that terrified Schultz that night had begun in a British laboratory, but it was American industrial genius and tactical innovation that transformed it into the most devastating weapon system of the war. While the British had invented radar, radio detection and ranging, in 1935, they had created a prototype. The Americans created an empire of electronic eyes. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 150,000 radar systems. Britain, fighting for survival, managed 30,000. Germany, despite having parallel radar research, produced fewer than 10,000, but the numbers told only part of the story. What mattered was not just quantity, but integration, refinement, and the uniquely American willingness to trust technology over human instinct. Captain Donald McIntyre of the Royal Navy, who sank 5 U-boats in 1943 alone, later wrote, "The Americans approached radar the way Henry Ford approached automobiles. They didn't just build better mousetraps, they built 10,000 identical mousetraps, trained 100,000 men to use them, and then refined the design every 6 weeks based on combat reports. We British invented the thing, but we still thought of it as a gentleman's auxiliary to seamanship. The Americans treated it like oxygen, essential, everywhere, non-negotiable." This philosophical difference would reshape naval warfare within 24 months of Pearl Harbor. July 1941, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge. The Radiation Laboratory, Rad Lab to those who worked there, occupied a former furniture store near Harvard Square. Inside its unmarked doors, 3,100 scientists and engineers were waging a different kind of war, one fought with oscilloscopes and magnetrons instead of guns and torpedoes. They worked 18-hour shifts, slept on cots between equations, and measured their progress in millimeters of wavelength. Dr. Luis Alvarez, who would later win the Nobel Prize for Physics, remembered the fevered atmosphere. "We knew the British were being bombed every night. We knew German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. And we knew, absolutely knew, that radar was the answer. The question wasn't whether it would work. The question was, could we make it small enough, light enough, precise enough, and cheap enough to win the war before we lost it?" The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: the cavity magnetron, a British invention hand-delivered to America in September 1940 by the Tizard mission. It was a cylinder of copper and ceramic, no larger than a dinner plate, that could generate microwaves at previously impossible power levels. American engineers looked at it the way Renaissance painters looked at perspective, as a tool that would change everything. Within 6 months, RadLab had designed 17 different radar systems. Within 12 months, American factories were producing them at a rate of 1,000 units per month. By 1943, that number had quintupled. The Germans never saw it coming because they never believed it possible. October 12, 1942, darkness over the Ruhr Valley, Germany. Oberst Dietrich Peltz climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter with the confidence of a man who owned the darkness. For 18 months, German night fighters had dominated the skies over the Reich, shooting down British bombers with impunity. The equation was simple. Darkness plus German experience plus ground-controlled interception equaled air superiority. On this night, Peltz would meet the American variable that shattered that equation. At 22,000 feet, flying through clouds so thick he couldn't see his own wingtips, Peltz's radio crackled with ground control vectors. Nachtjäger 4-4, target at your 11 o'clock, 3 kilometers, Angels 23. He turned left, squinting into the murk, seeing nothing. The British bombers, he knew, couldn't see him either. This was the ancient dance. The hunter, circling blind, hoping for a glimpse, a silhouette, a moment of luck. Then his aircraft shuddered. Cannon shells, American .50 caliber, ripped through his left engine cowling. The second burst took off his tail stabilizer. Peltz managed to bail out at 18,000 feet, his parachute opening into clouds so thick he couldn't see the ground until he was 50 meters above it. He had been shot down by an aircraft he never saw, by a pilot who had tracked him through solid cloud using AN/APS-6 radar mounted in the nose of a P-61 Black Widow night fighter. The Americans had turned darkness into transparency. Lieutenant Colonel Winston Red Roberts, who flew that mission, later described the experience in his combat report. The radar scope showed him as a bright blip 4 miles out. I followed the blip through 3 turns and a dive. Never saw the actual aircraft until my cannons lit him up. The German pilot was good, experienced, aggressive, making all the right moves. But he was fighting blind while I had perfect vision. It wasn't a fair fight. That was exactly the point. By war's end, American-built airborne radar equipped 7,000 night fighters, American, British, and Soviet. German bomber crews, accustomed to operating with impunity under darkness, found themselves hunted with mechanical precision. Luftwaffe night bombing raids, which had terrorized London in 1940-1941, became suicide missions by 1943. The statistical shift was brutal. German bomber losses jumped from 3% per mission to 22% per mission in night operations over Allied territory. General Adolf Galland, commander of Germany's fighter forces, wrote bitterly in his post-war memoirs, "The American radar network turned our bombers into target practice. We were shooting in the dark while they were shooting in daylight. There is no tactical doctrine that can overcome such an advantage. We were not defeated by better pilots or better tactics. We were defeated by better electronics." The psychological impact exceeded the tactical advantage. German air crews began refusing night missions. Morale collapsed not from cowardice, but from mathematics. When survival rates drop below 50% over 5 missions, courage becomes insufficient. January 1943. The Atlantic Ocean, 200 miles east of Newfoundland. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, one of Germany's most decorated U-boat commanders, sat in his tiny cabin aboard U-96, reading intercepts that should have been impossible. Allied convoys were changing course 6 hours before his wolf pack could intercept them. Routes that should have been secret were somehow known. Ambush positions that should have been perfect somehow resulted in the hunters becoming the hunted. The mathematics didn't work. There were 250 U-boats in the Atlantic. They operated under radio silence. They coordinated through coded short-burst transmissions. They attacked at night, submerged during day, surfaced only when absolutely necessary. Every tactical doctrine emphasized stealth, surprise, patience. Yet the Allies were sinking U-boats at a rate that defied explanation. In January 1943 alone, 23 German submarines were destroyed. In March, 31. In May, 43. Lehmann-Willenbrock didn't know that above him, invisible in the darkness, American PBY Catalina patrol aircraft were circling at 5,000 feet, their AN/APS-3 radar painting his submarine as a bright return on their scopes. He didn't know that his U-boat, when surfaced, reflected radar waves as clearly as a mirror reflects sunlight. He didn't know that American destroyer escorts were hunting him not with guesswork, but with geometric precision, their SG surface search radar giving them a 60-mile detection range in conditions where human eyes were worthless. What he knew was this: the Atlantic was no longer safe. The ocean that had once hidden his submarine now felt transparent, as if the water itself had betrayed him. The technology that made Lehman Willenbrock feel naked was American production genius applied to British innovation. The AN/APS-3 radar, mounted in a bathtub-shaped radome under the Catalina's fuselage, could detect a surfaced submarine at 11 miles. The SG radar, standard equipment on every American destroyer after mid-1942, could track surface vessels at 25 miles and low-flying aircraft at 15 miles, in absolute darkness, through fog, through rain. But radar was only half the equation. Below the surface, another American technological advantage was reshaping submarine warfare, sonar. ASDIC, Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, had been invented by the British in World War I, but like radar, it remained a laboratory curiosity until American engineers transformed it into a mass-produced weapon. The Americans called it sonar, sound navigation and ranging, and by 1943, they were installing it on every destroyer, escort, corvette, and submarine chaser in the fleet. Commander Donald McIntyre, hunting U-boats in the North Atlantic, described the transformation. Before sonar, hunting submarines was like hunting tigers in fog. You knew they were there, you knew they were deadly, but you were essentially guessing. With sonar, we could hear them breathe. We could track them as they maneuvered. We could maintain contact even when they dove to 600 feet. The psychological advantage was immense. The U-boat commanders knew we could hear them. They knew that every move they made created sound. They knew they were no longer invisible. The statistics bore out the transformation. In 1942, German U-boats sank 1,160 Allied merchant ships. In 1943, despite having more submarines operational, they sank 463. In 1944, just 132. The U-boat arm, which had nearly strangled Britain in 1942, was broken not by courage or superior seamanship, but by electronics and mass production. April 19, 1943, the Bay of Biscay. Oberleutnant Klaus Bargston commanded U-521 with the same fatalistic discipline that characterized the U-boat service in its final years. Every man aboard knew the statistics. 70% of U-boats never returned from their patrols. Yet they sailed because sailors sail, because duty demands, because the alternative, surrender, was unthinkable. At 0400 hours, running on the surface to recharge batteries, Bargston was drinking ersatz coffee in the conning tower when his radar detector began screaming. The METOX system, crude but functional, could detect enemy radar emissions at ranges up to 30 kilometers. It was the only early warning system U-boats possessed, and it had saved countless lives. Bargston ordered an immediate dive. U-521 was at 20 meters and descending when the depth charges began falling. The first pattern was close enough to shatter light bulbs and spring leaks in a dozen pipe joints. The second pattern was perfect, straddling the submarine's position with mathematical precision. The explosions that killed all 47 men aboard U-521 came from depth charges dropped by a British Sunderland flying boat whose ASV Mackay III radar had tracked the submarine through its entire dive sequence. The METOX detector, Bargston's only defense, had been useless. The British had switched to centimetric wavelength radar, operating at 3 centimeters instead of 1.5 meters, which the German detectors couldn't sense. Bargston and his crew died without knowing they'd been visible the entire time. The centimetric radar revolution exemplified American-British collaboration at its finest. British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment invented the cavity magnetron. American engineers at RAD Lab perfected its mass production. British tactical doctrine integrated it into anti-submarine warfare. American industrial capacity produced 50,000 units by war's end. Vice Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, understood the implications with brutal clarity. In a May 1943 conference with Hitler, he stated, "The enemy has rendered the U-boat war impossible." He has achieved this through a single technical development, radar that operates on wavelengths our detectors cannot sense. Our submarines surface to recharge batteries, believing themselves invisible in darkness, and are destroyed by aircraft they never detect. This is not a tactical problem. This is a technological checkmate. Hitler characteristically blamed the commanders rather than acknowledge the technological gap. But Dönitz was right. By mid-1943, American and British anti-submarine forces were sinking U-boats faster than German shipyards could build them. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had nearly strangled Britain's supply lines, had been won, not by more ships or braver sailors, but by radar and sonar. June 1944, English Channel, D-Day -2 hours. Flight Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Doolittle, Jr., no relation to the famous general, flew his B-17 Flying Fortress at 18,000 feet through cloud cover so dense that his co-pilot, visible 3 feet away, appeared as a gray shadow. Below, invisible beneath clouds and darkness, lay the Normandy beaches, where 156,000 Allied troops would land in 4 hours. Doolittle's mission was both simple and impossible: destroy the German coastal defense guns at Point du Hoc without seeing the target. Traditional bombing doctrine said this was impossible. You cannot hit what you cannot see. But Doolittle's B-17 carried an AN/APQ-13 bombing radar, a technological marvel that transformed clouds from obstacles into irrelevancies. On his radar scope, the Norman coastline appeared as a bright line. The concrete bunkers of Point du Hoc showed as hard returns against the softer echoes of surrounding terrain. At 03:15 hours, flying blind through weather that would have grounded previous generations of bombers, Doolittle released his payload with geometric precision. His bombs, 12 500-pound high-explosive devices, struck within 30 meters of their target. Not a single German gun at Point du Hoc fired on the invading troops when they landed 5 hours later. The tactical revolution represented by blind bombing cannot be overstated. Before radar, bombing through clouds was guesswork. Bomber crews either waited for clear weather or dropped ordnance randomly, hoping for lucky hits. The strategic implications were profound. German factories, knowing that bad weather meant safety, scheduled vital production for winter months when cloud cover protected them. American H-2X radar, dubbed Mickey by crews, shattered this calculus. Operating at 3-centimeter wavelength, it could map terrain through 10 miles of solid cloud. An experienced radar operator could identify cities, rivers, rail yards, and industrial complexes as clearly as a visual bombardier on a sunny day. The statistics demonstrated the impact. In 1942, the 8th Air Force achieved an average circular error probable, CEP, of 1,200 feet, meaning half their bombs landed within a quarter mile of the target. By 1944, with radar bombing, CP improved to 400 feet despite worse weather. More importantly, bombing could continue year-round, regardless of conditions. German industrial production, which had increased steadily through 1943 despite Allied bombing, plateaued in 1944 and collapsed in 1945. Not because bombs became more powerful, but because they became inescapable. There was no sanctuary in darkness, no safety in storms, no hiding in winter fog. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later testified, "The Allied bombing offensive became genuinely devastating only when radar-equipped bombers began hitting targets with consistency regardless of weather." Before mid-1943, we could schedule critical production during bad weather and expect relative safety. After mid-1943, weather became irrelevant. This, more than anything else, crippled our war production. March 1945. The North Atlantic, the final hunt. Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke commanded U-515 with the grim determination of a man who knew he was already dead. By March 1945, the U-boat service had become a death sentence. Of the 162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 784 had been lost. The survival rate for U-boat crewmen was 25%, worse odds than Soviet penal battalions faced at Stalingrad. Yet Henke sailed because the alternative, remaining in port, meant court-martial and execution. The Nazi regime, facing inevitable defeat, had become more interested in punishing perceived cowardice than in winning the war. On March 9th, running submerged at periscope depth, Henke detected a convoy through his hydrophones, the grinding of merchant ship propellers, the faster patter of destroyer escorts, the rhythmic ping of active sonar searching the depths. He maneuvered U-515 into attack position, calculating firing solutions with the precision that had made him one of Germany's top U-boat aces. 23 confirmed kills, 58,000 tons of Allied shipping sent to the bottom. What Henke didn't know was that his submarine had been tracked for 14 hours by a coordinated network of American and British forces using HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, dubbed Huff Duff by operators. Every radio transmission U-515 made, every coded position report, had been triangulated with mathematical precision. 3 destroyer escorts were converging on his position, their sonar operators watching U-5 and 15 maneuver like chess players observing an opponent's moves. When Henke launched his torpedoes at 16:47 hours targeting a Liberty ship at 2,000 meters, the destroyers already had firing solutions calculated. As U-515's torpedoes left their tubes, creating distinctive cavitation signatures that sonar operators recognized instantly, depth charges began falling. The pattern was perfect. U-515 imploded at 280 meters depth, killing all 53 men aboard. The entire engagement from first sonar contact to destruction lasted 9 minutes. The Americans expended 67 depth charges. The merchant ship Henke had targeted never knew it had been threatened. This was modern naval warfare reduced to mathematics and electronics. The romantic era of submarine aces hunting convoys by moonlight had ended. In its place came a sterile, efficient system where detection meant death, where silence meant survival, where human courage and experience became secondary to technological superiority. Grand Admiral Dönitz officially ended the U-boat campaign on May 4, 1945, 4 days before Germany's surrender. His final message to his submarine fleet read, "You have fought like lions. You have destroyed enemy ships worth millions of tons, but you have been defeated by a technology against which bravery is insufficient. Surface immediately and surrender to Allied forces. Do not sacrifice yourselves needlessly." Of the 156 U-boats still at sea when that order was transmitted, 153 surrendered. 3 scuttled themselves rather than face capture. Not a single U-boat commander attempted to continue fighting. The technology had broken not just the submarines, but the will to resist. The transformation. Lieutenant Eugene Fluckey, commander of the USS Barb, an American submarine operating in the Pacific, represented the other side of the technological coin. While German U-boats were being hunted to extinction by sonar and radar, American submarines equipped with the same technologies were devastating Japanese shipping with impunity. The USS Barb, utilizing SJ surface search radar and advanced sonar, sank 17 Japanese ships totaling 95,260 tons during 1944-1945. Fluckey's success came not from superior seamanship, though he possessed that in abundance, but from superior technology. His radar could detect surface vessels at 20 miles. His sonar could track submerged submarines at 5,000 meters. His fire control computer, fed by radar and sonar data, could calculate firing solutions faster and more accurately than any human. The contrast with German U-boats was stark. Both forces operated submarines. Both employed experienced, brave commanders. Both faced determined enemies. Yet American submarines sank 1,214 Japanese merchant ships while losing 52 submarines. German U-boats sank 2,179 Allied ships while losing 784 submarines. The difference was technological: radar, sonar, fire control computers, and industrial. American submarine production outpaced losses by 5-1. Fluckey's memoir, Thunder Below, captured the transformation succinctly. "We hunted like wolves, but we hunted with electronic eyes and ears. The Japanese Navy, like the German Navy, was fighting a 1918 war with 1918 technology against an enemy that had leaped into 1950. The outcome was never in doubt once the technological gap became apparent." The Hidden War. The men who won this technological victory never fired a shot. They worked in laboratories, factories, and training facilities thousands of miles from combat zones. They were physicists who calculated wavelength propagation, engineers who designed cavity magnetrons, factory workers who assembled radar sets at rates that seemed impossible, and instructors who taught 120,000 radar operators and sonar technicians the skills that would win the war. Dr. Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, coordinated this massive effort from an unmarked office building in Washington. Under his leadership, the radiation laboratory at MIT transformed from a furniture store housing 30 scientists into a technological powerhouse employing 3,900 personnel and spending $1.5 million per month, equivalent to $27 million monthly in 2024 dollars. The scale was unprecedented. By 1945, American factories had produced 150,000 radar systems of various types, 850,000 sonar transducers, 2.3 million vacuum tubes specifically designed for radar equipment, 45,000 magnetrons, training courses that certified 78,000 radar technicians, and 42,000 sonar operators. This industrial mobilization, transforming cutting-edge physics into mass-produced war equipment in less than 4 years, represented a uniquely American approach to warfare. Where German scientists created superior prototypes but lacked production capacity, and British scientists invented breakthrough technologies but couldn't scale production, American engineers created systems that could be manufactured by workers with minimal training, maintained under combat conditions, and replaced when damaged. The philosophical difference was profound. German radar development remained centralized in research institutes, prioritizing theoretical perfection over practical application. British development remained focused on defending the homeland, creating excellent systems for limited deployment. American development embraced mass production from the beginning, accepting that 80% effectiveness in 100,000 units would defeat 100% effectiveness in 10,000 units. This industrial philosophy, quantity creating its own quality through ubiquity, transformed radar and sonar from exotic technologies into standard equipment. By 1945, radar was as common on American ships as deck guns. Sonar was standard on every submarine chaser. The electronic revolution wasn't about creating wonder weapons, it was about making electronic warfare boring, routine, and inescapable. The psychological dimension. The impact of radar and sonar transcended statistics and kill ratios. These technologies created a psychological transformation that affected both users and targets. Allied personnel developed what researchers later termed technological confidence, a profound belief that their equipment gave them supernatural advantages. German and Japanese personnel developed technological fatalism, a conviction that defeat was inevitable because the enemy possessed abilities that bordered on magic. Lieutenant Werner Hartmann, a Luftwaffe bomber pilot shot down by American night fighters in December 1943, spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp processing his experience. His post-war testimony captured the psychological impact. "We knew the Americans had radar. We knew they could track aircraft at night, but knowing intellectually and experiencing viscerally are different things. When you're shot down on a moonless night through solid cloud by an enemy you never saw, never heard, never detected, it breaks something inside you. Not courage, not resolve, but certainty. You lose the certainty that skill and experience matter. You become convinced that technology has made human qualities irrelevant." This psychological dimension partly explained the collapse of German military morale in 1944-1945. Soldiers could accept defeat by superior numbers or better tactics. They struggled to accept defeat by invisible, inescapable technology. The radar-directed artillery that destroyed German armor concentrations without observation, the sonar-directed depth charges that killed submarines without visual contact, the radar-equipped night fighters that destroyed bombers without being seen. These created a sense of helplessness that no amount of propaganda could counter. Allied personnel experienced the opposite psychological trajectory. Sailors who had feared submarine attacks gained confidence when sonar was installed on their escorts. Bomber crews who had feared night fighters relaxed when their aircraft received radar warning systems. The technology transformed fear into confidence, uncertainty into control. Captain Gilbert Roberts, who ran the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, a training facility for anti-submarine warfare, observed, "After we installed sonar on escort vessels, the change in crew morale was immediate and dramatic. Previously, submarine encounters felt like duels in darkness, tense, unpredictable, terrifying. With sonar, crews felt like hunters rather than prey. They could hear the submarine maneuvering, track its position, predict its movements. The technology didn't just improve our tactical effectiveness, it transformed sailors' psychological relationship with the enemy." May 8, 1945. The Invention. When Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, the technological gap between Allied and Axis forces had widened into a chasm. American and British forces possessed shipborne radar with 100-mile detection ranges, airborne radar capable of tracking individual vehicles through cloud cover, sonar systems that could detect submarines at 10,000 meters, integrated command and control networks linking radar stations across entire continents, mass-produced training systems that could certify operators in 6 weeks. Germany and Japan possessed prototype systems with equivalent theoretical capabilities, but lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. A technological advantage that had seemed like a slight edge in 1942 had become overwhelming superiority by 1945. The post-war interrogations of German military leaders revealed their understanding of this disparity. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, testified at Nuremberg. The turning point was not El Alamein or Stalingrad. Those were tactical defeats. The strategic turning point occurred when American production capability made radar and sonar ubiquitous. We could not compete with an enemy who possessed perfect vision while we operated blindly. Grand Admiral Donitz was more specific. The U-boat campaign failed not because our submarines were inferior or our commanders lacked courage. It failed because every Allied escort vessel had sonar, every Allied aircraft had radar, and every Allied port had direction-finding equipment. We were trying to wage guerrilla warfare against an enemy who could see everything, hear everything, and respond everywhere. This was not war. It was extermination. The legacy. Kapitän-Leutnant Werner Schultz, who survived the depth charge attack that opened this narrative, spent the remainder of the war in a British POW camp. He was liberated in June 1945 and returned to Germany, where he lived until 1987. In a 1982 interview with the German magazine Der Spiegel, he reflected on that March night in 1943. "I never saw the aircraft that nearly killed us. I never heard it. Our lookouts, experienced men who had survived 2 years of Atlantic warfare, saw nothing. The ocean was dark, the sky was darker, the clouds covered everything. Yet the Americans dropped depth charges with precision that seemed supernatural. For years afterward, I had nightmares where invisible eyes watched me from darkness. Only decades later did I understand. They weren't supernatural. They were simply American. They had transformed radio waves into vision and sound waves into hearing. We were fighting with binoculars and compasses. They were fighting with electronics. We never had a chance." The technological transformation that terrified Schultz reshaped not just World War II, but all subsequent warfare. The radar and sonar systems developed between 1940 and 1945 established principles that govern modern military technology: integration over isolation, mass production over prototype perfection, and ubiquitous capability over concentrated excellence. Today's military forces inherit this legacy. Modern warships carry radar systems descended directly from the SG radar that tracked German U-boats. Contemporary submarines use sonar technology whose principles were established in Allied submarine chasers. The GPS satellites that enable precision weapons evolved from the radio navigation systems developed at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, but the deeper legacy is philosophical. The American approach to World War II technology, build it everywhere, use it everywhere, refine it constantly, became the template for military technological development. The Pentagon's doctrine of network-centric warfare, The Air Force's emphasis on information dominance, the Navy's investment in integrated sensor systems, all trace their intellectual lineage to those 3,900 scientists and engineers working in a converted furniture store in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Epilogue: The Invisible Victory. The men who developed radar and sonar received little public recognition during the war. Security classifications prevented discussing these technologies publicly until years after the war ended. No Medal of Honor was awarded for designing the cavity magnetron. No ticker tape parade celebrated the engineers who perfected centimetric radar. The victory they enabled was invisible, bureaucratic, unglamorous, and absolutely decisive. Dr. Luis Alvarez, reflecting on his wartime work in his 1987 autobiography, wrote, "We knew we were making history, but we didn't realize we were remaking warfare itself. We thought we were building better detection equipment. We were actually obsoleting centuries of naval and aerial tactics." The admirals, who had spent decades mastering visual navigation and optical range-finding, woke up one day to discover their expertise was obsolete. The submarine commanders who had perfected the art of silent running found that silence was insufficient when the enemy could see through darkness and hear through water. The numbers support Alvarez's assessment. In 1942, before radar and sonar became ubiquitous, Germany came within weeks of winning the Battle of the Atlantic. By 1944, with these technologies standard equipment, the Atlantic had become a graveyard for U-boats. In 1942, German night bombers struck British cities with relative impunity. By 1944, night bombing had become suicide. In 1942, Japanese submarines threatened American supply lines across the Pacific. By 1944, Japanese submarines were reduced to ineffectiveness by sonar-equipped escorts. The technological revolution was not gradual. It was a step function, a sudden transition from one state to another. The military leaders who began the war assuming that darkness, fog, and ocean depths provided sanctuary ended the war, understanding that no sanctuary existed against an enemy with electronic vision. The final accounting. When historians assess World War II's turning points, they typically focus on battles: Midway, Stalingrad, Normandy. But the truly decisive transformations occurred in laboratories and factories, where physicists and engineers created the technologies that made those victories possible. Consider the strategic impact. The Battle of the Atlantic, 1942, 1,160. Allied merchant ships sunk, 87 U-boats lost. 1943, 463 Allied merchant ships sunk, 244 U-boats lost. 1944, 132 Allied merchant ships sunk, 249 U-boats lost. The transformation wasn't about building more escorts or training better crews. It was about installing sonar on every vessel and radar on every aircraft. Strategic bombing. 1942, 50,000 tons of bombs dropped on Germany, 70% missing targets by over 1 mile. 1943, 200,000 tons dropped, 50% missing targets by over 1 mile. 1944, 900,000 tons dropped, 30% missing targets by over 1 mile. The improvement wasn't better bomb sights or more accurate crews. It was radar bombing through any weather conditions. Night-air warfare. 1940-1942, German bombers conducted 71,000 sorties over Britain with 3% losses. 1943-1945, German bombers conducted 8,000 sorties over Allied territory with 22% losses. The difference was radar-equipped night fighters that transformed darkness from cover into irrelevance. These statistics represent not just military victories, but a fundamental transformation in warfare's nature. The invisible technologies, radar waves bouncing off metal hulls, sonar pings echoing off submarine pressure hulls, killed more effectively than bombs and bullets because they enabled bombs and bullets to find their targets with previously impossible precision. March 17, 1943, 2:47 a.m., North Atlantic. Captain Lieutenant Werner Schultz, pressed against his periscope, watching concentric circles spread across his coffee cup, didn't know he was witnessing the future. He thought he was experiencing a particularly accurate depth charge attack, unfortunate but comprehensible within his framework of naval warfare. He didn't realize that the American aircraft circling above him, invisible in absolute darkness, represented a new paradigm where human senses had become obsolete, where experience and courage were insufficient, where the laws of physics, properly harnessed, defeated the finest seamanship. The Americans hadn't just built better weapons. They had built a different kind of war, one where electrons moving through vacuum tubes determined victory or defeat, where information dominance mattered more than numerical superiority, where the invisible realm of electromagnetic radiation became the decisive battlefield. Schultz survived that night. U-247 limped back to port, its hull dented but intact, its crew traumatized but alive. Schultz survived the war, lived to see his grandchildren, and died peacefully in his sleep at age 73. But that night in March 1943, when unseen eyes tracked him through darkness and ocean, something inside him died. The certainty that skill and experience mattered, the belief that human qualities could overcome technological disadvantages, the sailor's faith that the sea itself would protect those who understood its secrets. The Americans had shown him a future where seas offered no sanctuary, where darkness provided no cover, where silence gave no safety. They had shown him a world where electronics had become more powerful than courage,